We know there are many choices in internet radio, and the staff and host of LA Talk Live would like to thank you for choosing the internet's hottest destination for the most eclectic sound and invigorating talk. This is LA Talk Live. We are more than just talk.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history.
You are listening to Faith on the Front Line with yours truly, Rev. Dr. Louis C. Logan II, Senior Pastor of Ruach Christian Community Fellowship and producer of our debut radio broadcast, Faith on the Front Line, where we highlight and underscore and illustrate the manner in which members and leaders of the faith community address local and global community issues, advocacy, economic justice, political rights, civil rights, and the like. I'm glad to be here with you today on LA Talk Live. Grateful to my man Richard Carr for his excellent service to community, and for all of you who are faithful listeners to LA Talk Live. And I hope and pray that you will be encouraged and enriched by this discourse and display of the manner in which faith activates people of goodwill who desire to see a beloved community. You listened in our intro to some of the opening remarks and words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who 50 years ago, a couple of days ago actually, spoke to the needs, the horrors, and the hopes of a nation torn along the racial divide, which W.E.B. Du Bois talked about in the cusp and precedent of the 20th century. I'm joined in studio in our discussion with my mentor and friend for many years, the Rev. Timothy McDonald, is calling from Atlanta, Georgia. He is the pastor and founder of First Iconium Baptist Church, and he's also the one of the past presidents of Atlanta's Black Clergy Concern Black Clergy rather, and he's also the president of the African American Ministers Leadership Conference that is connected to the People for the American Way. Are you there, Reverend McDonald?
I'm doing great, Brother Louis.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being on the line. As always, as I was saying to our listening audience, you have been a mentor for many years. I don't only want to date myself. It goes back to your days at SCLC, and I guess appropriately so, because as you know, in this debut broadcast, we want to talk about your reflections on what you experienced some 50 years ago. I hate to date you in that sense. And what you reflect on as relates to what happened in the most recent commemorative celebration and expressions of solidarity and remembrance, and perhaps even expectation for America and for our people.
Well, I'm glad that people actually celebrate it. I think that's certainly commendable. But what happens is we don't know our history. And I think it's important to go back to the actual 1963 march that was put together really by A. Philip Randolph and organized by Rayon Preston. A. Philip Randolph was identified in 1919 by the United States Attorney General as the most dangerous Negro in America.
Wow.
Labeled as a socialist. Bayard Rustin was called a communist, and they were radicals. That's who organized the 1963 march. A lot of people think that it was Dr. King and SCLC that organized that march, but that is it's not true. It was A. Philip Randolph who actually introduced Dr. King. So when I look at these past last Saturday and even Wednesday, I have to ask myself, to what extent did they connect this march to the original march that was for jobs and the desegregation of public accommodations in schools and the like? What was it really tied to? And that, I believe, is the challenge for our time. This is our watch now, and we can reflect on history. Certainly that's a commendable thing, or we can understand that we are making history right now.
Right. Absolutely. That certainly does set precedent. And as you make that connection and you experienced, are you saying, Reverend Timothy McDonald, that you experienced a kind of continuance or a disconnect?
Well, I think there was a remembrance, and remembrance does not necessarily connote continuance.
Okay.
Let's be clear on that. And I think it is important to remember. It is important to reflect. But I think America gave us the I Have a Dream that if your listening audience really did their research would know that was not even an intended part of Dr. King's speech for that day. He was talking about that check and that insufficient fund and bankruptcy and all of those kinds of economic issues that were affecting black people. He was in Memphis with the sanitation workers when he was killed. He was organizing the Poor People's Campaign, but they were going to literally occupy the nation's capital. And so I think it's important to commemorate, but let us not confuse commemoration with continuation. We have a lot of work to do. There are a number of issues facing our people, particularly still black people. Certainly we've made a lot of advances. I won't deny that, tremendous advances. But we still have a long way to go with our criminal justice system. Our country incarcerates more people than any other country on the face of the earth. And many of them disproportionately are us, and particularly young black males. And so I would have loved to have seen legislation at this march tied to diminishing the incarceration of young black males. I would have loved to have seen, or at least heard during this past march, something about a livable wage, not a minimum wage, but a livable wage, which is some of what they talked about in 1963. I would have loved to have had this march talk about serious immigration reform that certainly included people of African descent and Caribbean and South American descent, and let's get some true immigration reform legislation passed. There was no legislation pending, as there was in 1963, that gave us the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. There was no legislation pending this year that we could rally behind, black and white and brown and yellow and rich and poor. And so to that extent, certainly I was somewhat disappointed. But I am encouraged that, it was a great educational opportunity for our children and for young people, which was another concern that I had, because if you look at that crowd 50 years ago, and I have asked even people who I've been around in various meetings, who was there in 63 or who participated, who saw it. And then I said, now subtract 50 years from that. How old were you? Pastor Logan, they were in their 20s. It was young people. And that element was not as prevalent or present this go round as certainly it was in 1963. It was young people who gave us the civil rights revolution. And we're going to be true to that, and we got to figure out how to include more and more young people.
Hold that point, Reverend McDonald, because I want to kind of piggyback on that and reflect also on some of the remarks of some of the speakers and move forward. I want to take just a real brief break just for a second and kind of get things assembled here, and then we're going to come right back. Can you hold the line, please?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to LA Talk Live, reality radio handcrafted for your listening pleasure. This is LA Talk Live, and we're more than just talk. Stay tuned.
Journey Sisters is an organization that embodies and captivates women from all walks of life. Our membership includes 44 women that are constantly growing in the areas of personal development and community involvement. Monthly, we offer free leadership classes at McKay's Restaurant. Journey aims to inform women in the areas of heart disease and HIV and AIDS. Experience the journey now by logging into www.journeymosaicinc.com. Toll free 888-906-5519. Journey with no excuses.
We're back with Faith on the Front Line and Rev. Timothy McDonald, First Iconium Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, one of my mentors at SCLC back in the day, and now with the African American Ministers Leadership Conference. And I am joined as well by my co-host, Reverend William Monroe Campbell, pastor of the great Mount Gilead Baptist Church, one of those who was at the feet of Reverend Thomas Kilgore, one of the major luminaries of the civil rights movement, and also Reverend William Epps, who was the pastor of Second Baptist Church here in the venerated and historic Second Baptist Church, where a lot of actually the West Coast headquarters of the civil rights movement. Dr. King on several occasions would come to Los Angeles and post up at Second Baptist Church, and he and Kilgore was running things. And here's a product. I'm so happy to have you. Say hello to our LA Talk Live family.
Greetings and good morning, and it's a joy to be with you and to give God praise for the opportunity to be a part of a conversation.
Absolutely.
That moves in the direction of continuing the work of liberation that began in Jesus Christ.
That's it. That's it.
And in response to him, to understand the sense of linkage and responsibility that we have for one another.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. And I want to encourage you to use your preacher voice a little bit, because I know you're trying to get yourself together here, but just kind of because I know you got it in you. All right, we're back with Rev. Timothy McDonald of Atlanta. He's on a Friday kind of hiatus. He's doing this as a favor to me, so I don't want to tie him up too long. But I want to thank you so much, Rev. McDonald, for taking time out of your Friday kind of downtime to be on this debut broadcast. And I want to thank those of you who are listening to Faith on the Front Line right now. I'd like to encourage you to email us or to call in and let us know what your thoughts and your feelings are about the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, and what are we doing about this? What are we doing going forward? Is there a real agenda? Do we really have a sense, as Reverend McDonald said, a sense of a real legislative agenda? Nothing was necessarily suggested. There were issues maybe have been mentioned. And there was one issue that wasn't brought up at all, I don't think, not to any great extent. That is the emerging, proposed and growing drumbeat of war towards Syria. And, what would Dr. King say? How would Dr. King register his sentiments in light of that particular issue? What do you think, Rev. McDonald?
Well, I'm very clear on what he would say. In fact, on April the 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year to the date when Dr. King was assassinated, he spoke out against the Vietnam War at Riverside Church. And it was from that point that I believe he had signed his death warrant. And in 1967, Dr. King gave an interview where he talked about how up until that time, the civil rights movement had not really cost America anything. The desegregating of schools and buses, as important as those acts were, did not really cost, in terms of dollars, America anything. And that's why he was getting ready to move with A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, with the sanitation workers, with the Poor People's Campaign, in the area that would cost literally billions and billions of dollars.
Yes.
So they were talking about redistribution of the wealth. They were talking about a livable wage. They were talking about the disparities in health care. He was talking about the cost of war and how that impacted the delivery of social programs here in the United States. So I have no doubt that he would have very, very serious reservation and questions about our involvement in Iraq, our involvement in Afghanistan, and even now what we're contemplating regarding Syria.
And of course, you heard Secretary of State John Kerry's comments about the moral crisis that the alleged recent chemical weapons used against the Syrian civilians has created, and yet the contradiction with U.S. support for then ally Saddam Hussein, who also used chemical weapons on the Kurds, who was that, 1988? And what kind of a contradiction that is in terms.
We should not be surprised by political contradictions. We have a history of political contradictions. It's more about political expediency than it is about political morality, and which is why Dr. King is to be honored. I think Dr. King was always consistent. He got in a lot of trouble even with his own cohorts, even those in SCLC, other civil rights leaders, because he was moving in this new direction and connecting the dots of morality and ethics and war and peace and economics. And ultimately, at the age of 39, it got him killed.
Yes.
Let's be clear on that. All these folks said they love Dr. King, want to follow Dr. King. Dr. King gave his life, and he knew that certainly was probably going to be his fate. But he did it because of his commitment and his integrity. And it's very hard to find that kind of commitment and integrity today.
Absolutely.
I would ask the question also whether or not what really happened with Dr. King was about personal evolution. As we remember, Dr. King was the third generation of pastoral leadership at the Ebenezer Church, even though he was at Dexter Avenue at the time. And Dr. King had actually talked about pursuing either medicine or law until he was at Morehouse College and went through a personal evolution. And through that personal evolution, taking a look at himself, realized that he had to reevaluate what he was all about. And in the course of dealing with his own experience of reevaluation of his values, began to speak about the nation and the need for the nation to reevaluate its values. We have to remember that what was happening was that this country, though it began with certain plaudits, was moving in a direction of pursuing the interests of those who had property and power. The whole 3/5 of our humanity went back to the sense of focusing on property and power. Jim Lawson likes to talk about plantation capitalism, and I wonder to what extent Dr. King, as he began to confront himself and his own limitations, then began to realize that we were called to rise above this self-centeredness that disregarded the value of other people and therefore challenged America to take a new look at itself. And that's why we could not get busy putting a finger in somebody else's eye without recognizing the log that was in our own eye. Dr. McDonald, to what extent would you think that it was this personal development that caused him to challenge America to rethink itself?
I have no doubt that you are absolutely right. Dr. King, I mean, if you look at his books, and, where do we go from here to the last one, Chaos or Community, he absolutely, and he admitted in numerous interviews that he had evolved and was still evolving, and it was over a period of time that he came to the position that he did, even with the war, even with going to Memphis, He was the first one to admit that he was evolving and growing in this process. And in that regard, he lost a lot of support.
Yes.
He lost a lot of support among his own people,
That's
from
right.
the Jewish community, from political allies. But he would not compromise his conscience, and I admire him for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that we're all growing. When you stop growing, you die.
Yeah, that's true.
And Dr. King was continuing to grow, and he was continuing to grow in the movement and taking the movement in a new and different direction, and that's why they killed him.
So in terms of growth, do either of you see the movement growing in any respect? Is it developing? And I want to pose the same question, the query to our listeners. Is the movement growing in any particular way that's recognizable, that provides some elements of hope or despair?
Well, a series of events does not mean movement.
That's right.
Let's be clear. Just because we have a series of events here, there, and yonder does not mean that there is a movement. We need a movement. When you look around and you got the Trayvon Martins, you got to stand your ground, you got, black people being unemployed twice as once, you got healthcare disparities. If ever there was a time when we needed a movement, a continuation movement, it is now. But the truth of the matter is that's just not happening.
Yes.
Because people are not willing to take the kind of risk. We like events, and we will come together for an event, but Dr. King was not engaged in events, a series of events. He indeed was engaged in a movement that ultimately cost him his life.
I remember when the Occupy movement, or so-called movement, was at its heyday, someone asked Reverend Jim Lawson his reflections about this emerging series of events, and he quickly said that it would not be prudent to call this a movement because it is very young in its development. A movement is a protracted, strategic, and sustained sense of activism over a period of time, and he was very reluctant to say that that was a movement that was going to really change America.
It's so. If you look at Gandhi, who was the model, and I want to also say before I have to leave that it was actually Bayard Rustin who introduced Dr. King to Gandhi's tactics. The one that the system labeled a communist. It was Bayard Rustin who almost on a daily basis, even starting with the Montgomery bus boycott, communicated with Dr. King. There were various reasons why he was not up front, but you're talking about a strategist and an intellectual and an organizer. Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, was his mentor, bar none. Where are the A. Philip Randolphs and the Bayard Rustins today? And I'm not trying to be either one, but we got to know our history. And we made that march in 1963. In fact, the truth to be told, they organized A. Philip Randolph in 1941.
Yes, that's right.
A movement actually called the March
Sleeping
on
Car
Washington Movement.
That's right.
In 1940.
That's right.
The
Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters.
In 63.
That's it.
And we don't teach that to our children. We don't even know that ourselves. You can't teach what you don't know. But it is important that we know that history because it was.
All right. Well, it appears that we've had the mention of Bayard Rustin.
More than any other country on the face of the earth, in and of itself requires a new movement.
The other thing that we need to pick up on, and you're exactly right, in 1941, Asa Philip Randolph had threatened FDR with a movement. But also in 1957, there was actually a march on Washington called the Pilgrimage to Washington that lifted up those issues. And it was at that point that Dr. King and Dr. Kilgore work together to lead the prayer pilgrimage to Washington. So things move step by step, so that what you said that Jim Slauson concerned about the Occupy movement being too young, what happens over an extended period of time as it gathers energy. It's like the snowball that as it rolls down the hill picks up and picks up and picks up and grows. And the question is the disconnect. To what extent have we, on one hand, invested our young people with our vision as over against becoming content? You see, the tragedy is that once you achieve some things, you have to raise the question, where is the next step? Right. And I think to a large extent, as we have achieved some things, as we've achieved some educational achievement, as we've achieved some occupational achievement, as we achieve some product achievement, we've sort of set back and become comfortable and not recognize that our focus need to be looking at the next step, because we are far from being able to arrive at the place that we need to be. We are far from having arrived at the point of truly experiencing freedom in this nation. And so we do, and I appreciate again, Dr. McDonald, you're putting that into focus for us to see ourselves in the broader picture and to raise the question of what are the next steps? What are the next issues? What are the next places where people are hurting? What are the next changes that have to come about so as to provide for all people being able to be life affirming and being able to be appreciative of one another?
Absolutely. As Rev. McDonald, I know you may have to go in a second. I want to invite and welcome the Reverend DamienConner, who is the Executive Director of SCLC, the COO of the National SCLC Board, and we want to welcome Reverend DamienConner on. How are you, Reverend Damien?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you for being on. I know you know Reverend McDonald as well, as the two of you have been interactive in Atlanta and other places around the country. Reverend McDonald, did you want to, Reverend Damien, just hold on a second, and Reverend McDonald, did you want to make any comments before you go?
I'm going to have to drop off now, but SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, still has a role to play. To redeem the soul of America was the mission, the stated mission of SCLC. If ever there was a time that the soul of America needs to be redeemed,
that's right.
It is now.
Okay. And
I hope that we don't bury our civil rights organizations, SCLC, the NAACP, at that time in '63, the Urban League. We need to find ways of leaving our egos at the door, working together to help in the liberation of our people. It's not a time for tripping and egotistical statements. It's the time for organizing, strategizing, and politicizing our people in spite of all that they're trying to do to depoliticize our people. This is our time in history. It's our watch. We're on the wall, and it's up to us what we do with it.
Well, Tim, thank you.
I want to thank you for this opportunity to share with your listening audience, Reverend Logan, and to certainly sound like serious colleagues in the struggle, brothers in the struggle, prophets in the struggle. Appreciate you so much and all the work that you do, and we got to find out how to connect as well, because ain't no one or two people, one or two leaders going to be able to do what needs to be done.
Absolutely.
We need all of us at the table with our egos at the door.
Oh, have mercy. You're preaching, Reverend. I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks in D.C. Reverend Conner, how are you? Yes, ma'am. Yes. You too. Tell Shirley I said hello, please. Reverend Conner, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Real well, thank you. Real well. Thank you for joining us on Faith on the Front Line. And tell us just a little bit about what you do. And if you don't mind, give us some reflection on your involvement to whatever extent in the recent Civil Rights 50th anniversary commemoration celebration events or activities.
Yeah. As you stated already, I'm the National Executive Director and COO for the Leadership Conference. And as far as what I do, I've been charged with organizing new programs and directing the organization with regards to its business. I've been involved for the past year in the planning of the week-long events, the March on Washington and the SCLC National Convention, which was in D.C., the 23rd through the 26th. So it was a busy, busy weekend. It was some great events, some great panels, some great conversations that were had. But what I took away from the experience over this past year was that there has to be more coalition building among the civil rights organizations, the legacy organizations, as well as the newer organizations that have formed. Because without that coalition, without that strength in the numbers, there is the work that needs to be done will not be able to get done. We've recently seen gains in the LGBTQ community with regard to organizing around marriage equality and things of that nature. But we have to be able to borrow some of the strategies from organizations that have been successful on the civil rights front so that we can forge a collective agenda and move forward. One thing that I was really concerned about, especially coming out of this March on Washington, was that there was no kind of collectivized, singular agenda that we left with. In 1963, they had an agenda, they had points, they had talking points. Everyone was on the same page. And I fear that in 2013, where we have technology and we have social media, that there is no collective agenda which is shared among the people who attended and those who can potentially be participants in fighting for rights for everyone. So, as we move forward, I'm really interested in seeing how we build coalitions and what that looks like, and how we're intentionally inclusive about how we do it, whether or not we bring in Native American organizations and Latino and African American organizations together to do the work of justice, because people are suffering. And so I think that our focus needs to be on the people and how we best work toward creating an equitable space in the U.S. for all people.
And that's interesting. And I know this, I think you're being a little diplomatic in terms of you saying you're interested in seeing what happens. But I sense, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but there's a frustration there. And yet there's a desire to really begin to make some things happen as well.
Right.
Am I
right. And you you're very discerning. In my experience over the past year, to Dr. McDonald's point, there are a lot of egos in this work that we're doing, and I think that a large part of the issue is that some within the rights community see their work as more important than others, which then again ties into privilege and how we understand privilege and positioning. And that, for me, is a contradiction to creating a space of equity and equality for the people that we serve. At the moment in which we believe that what we do or who we are is more important than the people we serve or the people we're attempting to service, is the moment that we probably need to take a step back and do some assessment of, who we need to become in this work that we're doing. So, I think that it is a time to put egos aside and realize that there's work out there to be done. I understand everybody wants a pat on the back every once in a while, but it's not about any one organization or one individual.
That's right.
This has to be a collective work, and if it's not, then we will perish together.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I want to kind of probe you a little bit more because you represent the new avant-garde, the new guard that's emerging. I think you're just around 30 or so. I hate to put your age out there, but
yeah, no, I am. I'll be 29 in a few months.
29 in a few months, and I mean, really, you're at where Dr. King was at some point in the work that he was doing, and I know that has to challenge you in terms of what you see happening, and what kind of things do you see happening among young people, because really your age group and younger really sets the tone for that. But let me ask you to do this. Hold on the line. We're just going to take just a little bit of a station break, a couple of announcements, and we'll come right back. Stay tuned. Faith on the Frontline family. We'll be right back right here at LA Talk Live.
Hi, I'm Monroe Williams, and I would like to invite you to join GospelRhythms.com every Sunday at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our show, GospelRhythms.com Talk Live Radio. Join us as we celebrate Christians around the world in all genres of entertainment, as well as highlight interest stories on men and women who are making a difference and impacting their community. So don't forget to tune in to GospelRhythms.com Talk Live Radio, exclusively on LaTalkLive.com. You can also catch us on iTunes under R&B or watch us live on Ustream TV. We are reality radio, handcrafted for your listening pleasure. This is GospelRhythms.com Talk Live Radio on LaTalkLive.com. We're more than just talk. We're heaven's party here on earth.
Hi, this is Dawn Christie inviting you to join me every Friday, 1 p.m. Pacific, for my all-new show, The Dawn Christie Show. Join me as I discuss love, spiritual readings, your purpose, why am I born, what am I here to do. So don't forget to tune in The Dawn Christie Show at 1 p.m. Pacific, exclusively on LA Talk Live. You can also catch us on iTunes Radio R&B or watch us on Ustream TV, reality radio, handcrafted for your listening pleasure. This is LA Talk Live, and we are more than just talk.
Welcome back to Faith on the Frontline. Faith on the Frontline family. I'm joined and in studio with my co-host, Reverend William Monroe Campbell.
Thank you, sir.
Community activist in his own right, a scholar, one of the luminaries of our community, and personal mentor and friend and brother. And I'm excited to have on the line the Rev. DamienConner, who is the executive director, COO of the National SCLC board. And I'm kind of squeezing him a little bit to get him to talk about what he envisions as a young leader for the future of the movement, so to speak. We were just talking about how current efforts and events are somewhat hamstringed by unfortunate challenges with agendas, egos, and efforts to vie for prominence, and also other agendas of even more veteran civil rights leaders and participants and individuals. How does that all work out as you look at it, Reverend Conner? I know that has to be wow, for no lack of vocabulary in that respect. What is that like?
Yeah, well, as far as working with veteran leaders, particularly in preparing for the March on Washington, it was, for lack of better terms, challenging. Yeah. There are. Well, let me start here. I was able to be a part of the BYP 100, which is the Black Youth Project, the meeting in Chicago back in June. And I was amazed at the types of work that the people who participated in the BYP 100 were doing in their respective communities. And these are people like mostly under 30. Within that group, there was just the overall desire to work in community, to do the work. Very little ego, but a lot of commitment. And nowadays, having the opportunity to work with some of our veteran leaders and some folk who have been around for quite a while, there's seemingly a disconnect. There's a disconnect from the actual work in talking points, the actual work in fundraising, the actual work and really being invested in the community and what the community concerns are. I believe there's this prevailing idea among veteran civil rights leaders that marching solves everything. but there's very little strategy. Dr. King marched and he had strategy. He agitated, which meant that his marching and his demonstrating was an effort to shine a light on what was actually happening in communities, particularly in Birmingham and in the Deep South, where racial prejudice and inequality was real time for the individuals there. And so I think that we have to always contextualize why Dr. King did what he did, and not just harken back to those methods as the only methods for moving forward and for progressing. As I mentioned earlier, there are plenty of communities now who have made many gains in their respective agendas to create equality or to get legislation passed. But my question is for the civil rights organizations now, particularly the legacy organizations, what were the methods? How did they tap into the communities? We know that social media is very important now to doing the work of getting word out and communicating. But was social media used to promote a single agenda for the March on Washington? What was the agenda coming out? And so the moment that we had to kind of capitalize on the energies that were connected to the march, I feel like it was kind of not wasted, but the potential wasn't maximized at the moment that we had the attention of the nation. So, as we move forward, I think that it's important for veteran leaders to take a step back and assess what's actually happening, and then determine whether or not, I don't necessarily believe in passing the torch, but I think that there's a need, a dire need to light other torches and not just hold fast to your flame and oil it when, for yourself. It's not about your light only. It's
spread
about
the flame,
lighting other people's torches, passing on the fire to the next generation.
I see you. And again, I appreciate your candor mixed with little dexterity there. You mentioned the BYP 100. Was there a developed agenda through that conversation and in that corpus at all?
Right. Well, in the BYP 100, there were conversations about how to develop an agenda and what those items would be. And we left there thinking about how we would respectively in our own spaces address the issues that were of primary concern to us. And we left away with poverty being one of them, incarceration being another, and basic issues of justice. So when we begin to think about stop and frisk, when we think about all the things that criminalize Black life in general, we were concerned about those issues. Because while we were there, the Trayvon Martin verdict. We were able to watch that together. And it was amazing. We all held hands actually as they read it.
You're kidding.
Some people fell out. We did. We held hands. And we had a moment of silence. People were crying. People were storming out of the room. People were cussing. Whatever they needed to do to emote in that moment, they did. And it was one of the most powerful moments that I ever experienced to hear people's life stories at that moment. And talk about how they've been graced in many ways to still be around in spite of many of the things that they went through, despite coming up in impoverished situations, even in the midst of the work that they do in the communities, the dangers they face on a daily basis, and some of them being, one actually having just come out of jail a month prior to joining with us. So, it was amazing to be among people who have real stories, and it wasn't about some neo-political, civil rights-y kind of aristocracy, but it was a real-life, real-time situation where people were talking about their lives. Most of these civil rights veterans, they're set up. They have their bank accounts. They're sturdy. They get paid for going to talk about Dr. King and their relationship with him, or not only that, but what they've done, And so while they subsist among what would be considered in the 60s, the class that was stable, that wouldn't have been radical because they were trying to protect their bottom line. There are people out there who don't really have a bottom line to protect because my generation graduated from college expected to get jobs and then didn't get them. So we have to be real about what the situation is. And I think that the veteran generation needs to recognize their own privilege within the matrix of how we operate with one another, and provide opportunities for people to come up. One thing that I have come to realize, as much as we all hate capitalism and what it means, it's not going away anytime soon. So we have to be conscious about how we share and how we are economically how we need to be economically codependent, and how we need to think about redistributing the wealth. You know, like, for people slapped Obama on the hand or whatever for even bringing up the idea of redistributing wealth, but how much are we doing that within our communities? Yes. Are we supporting our business? Are we supporting the next generation? And I just don't think that the support that needs to be there from the veteran class is there. And I fear that that veteran class will become kind of the aristocracy of civil rights and not contribute back in the ways that are actually necessary beyond talking points.
As soon as you get a chance, you either need to author a couple of articles, you need to start writing a book. I think you need to reflect on, and I'm nobody to tell you what to do, but I'm not even to suggest that you haven't already done it, but what you just said and what you're talking about in terms of the BYP 100 really could be the catalyst for what would conjoin with the other movement that just kicked off, or the actions, a series of actions that kicked off yesterday. I think started in New York back in maybe November of last year, and has swept the nation yesterday with the fast food workers in their fight for 15.
Right.
I had the privilege of attending an organizing conference in Detroit, Michigan, and the energy, the brilliance, the sense of seriousness and sobriety that these young sisters and brothers bring to the table is awesome. And I think that if honed and if directed, and if you all figure out where you want to go, this thing would be an emerging new wave of the movement, if you will.
There's another thing I also want to lift up, because you've several times mentioned a tool that you have available to you that cannot be understated. That's the whole concept of social media. Yeah. Part of what we have to recognize with Dr. King is that Dr. King gained strength because of all of the civil rights leaders at the time, beginning with A. Philip Randolph, with Roy Wilkins, with Whitney Young, with before her Mary McLeod Bethune, but then later Dorothy Height. With all of those leaders, Martin King had one distinction, and that distinction was that he was a preacher. And as a preacher, he had access to the pulpits across the nation, and so he was able to go to pulpits all across the nation and be able to communicate. And in addition to his gift in terms of oratory, it was the access. Now you've spoken about another generation that has the gift of its command of social media beyond which the previous generations have had. And so the question is, how do you make that work to advance the kinds of concerns that you have? Most of us, I happen to be 66 years old, most of us who are in a sense at a point of transition in our life, and I don't mean leaving the battlefield, but yet at a transitioning point in life, don't have those skills, don't have that mastery. But you have that mastery, and so it's a matter of how do you make it work so as to address the kinds of issues. The other thing that you've alluded to in terms of the March on Washington, going back to 1963, the fact that A. Philip Randolph was able to facilitate the coming together of the NAACP, of the Urban League, of the SNCC, of CORE, of the National Council of Negro Women, made a significant move of pulling people together who had not in fact been together. It was a statement in its own right. And so now you have the capacity with the command of the social media to be able to bring diverse elements of the community together and to focus on what are the issues that are hurting our community and how do we organize to address those issues. And so it's a matter of beginning to work with what you have. Again, I'm a preacher, so I'm going to go back to Moses when God says to Moses, what do you have in your hand? And he discovers his rod can become a snake, and it becomes a snake in terms of impacting the whole sense of the magical arts that influence the thinking of Pharaoh. You have in your hand the command of social media. So with that command, you're able to begin to make a difference. So you don't have to sit back and wait. You have to move forward to make a positive difference, but ensuring that your focus is on being able to work toward the liberation of all people. And I think you have the capacity to do it.
Reverend Conner, you're getting more than what you bargained for, brother. You didn't know the officer was going to come at you when you called in. It's my fault. I apologize. When I see you in a couple of weeks, I'll just be kind of ducking because I want you to hurt a brother. I mean, you've been given some marching orders, brother, and I'm sure you felt the weight of compulsion when you were, like you said, in that moment when the Zimmerman verdict was read. Just the sense of awe and frustration. Talk to me.
Let me also add to that.
Let me respond. Go ahead, Reverend Conner.
Okay. Well, I'll say this. Social media is a tool to get the message out, as was, a copy machine in 1963, which they didn't have officially, right? And to send out letters and to a mailing, so to speak. And it's a tool. But I think what's important is what you put on that piece of paper, right? Exactly. Like the actual agenda. And what I fear is that even though I know what we do have with regard to the tools, I know what we don't embrace, which is our real truth, right? We talk about voting rights, but we don't talk about what's happening in our communities. What do voting rights mean to folk who are being locked up and given felony charges? You know, what does that look like? What does it look like for the father who goes to jail and has a felony charge and a woman behind with 2 kids? You know, what does that look like on a daily basis? And part of what I was trying to articulate earlier is that my fear is, as kind of a aristocracy that has lost connection with the community and the real stories, we will talk about voting rights, and we will talk about it from kind of a ivory tower perspective, a kind of upstairs looking down on the ground kind of perspective. But how many have really been in communities lately? How many have really walked the streets? You know, people tell the story often of Dr. King going to Marks, Mississippi, which was his kind of motivation to start the Poor People's Campaign. But how many of us are actually going into the communities and looking and seeing the real life situations and what's happening with our communities that we call ourselves serving? So while social media is cool, we have to have a real agenda, and we have to address the truth. For instance, one of the things that was brought up this weekend that connects to a whole lot of other issues in our communities is the fact that Bayard Rustin, who was actually the kind of person who thought up SCLC, was kind of left out of the history of 1963, and he was the organizer of the March on Washington. He was I believe, the executive director of the March on Washington, and he was left out primarily because he was a gay man, right? So how many of us are having conversations about sexuality in our church, about HIV and AIDS, not that the two are necessarily connected, but those are real conversations that need to be had because we're dealing with a different generation. We're dealing with people who are openly dealing with their sexuality in churches, or openly dealing with issues of disease and of marginalization. Then how do we deal with the marginal of our community if we call ourselves reverends and ministers, right? And so I'm really ready for us to do away with the titles if we're not really willing to do the work. You know, it was a lot of work for Jesus to walk through communities and to heal people, you know, in spite of the fact that he was being hated on by not only the Romans, but the Jewish folk, the church people, the people who are supposed to be holding up the banner of righteousness. You know, so what does righteousness look like? How do we do work that is really righteous if we're not honest and truthful about what the situation is? So while social media is a tool, it is not the message, you know, and I think that our focus needs to be on the truth of the message and really dealing with the hurts, the pains, the situations that our communities face on a daily basis.
Absolutely. So given that, have you had a chance to blog or correspond with any of the attendees to your conference, and what do you see as next steps?
Well, next steps for us, and I've had a conversation about this today, is really taking a step back to survey our experience, number one, and then to determine concretely what our next steps actually will be, and what with regard to our capacity. And I think that for us, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in particular, that's important because you don't want to take on a challenge that you don't have the capacity to necessarily handle. This goes back to the tools. What do you have in your hand? So with that, we're really doing an assessment and really determining what the next steps will be. Mm-hmm. One of our primary focuses right now is economic justice, because there's so many things that are connected to that, like education, healthcare, and things of that nature. And then we know in 2014, we have a major election coming up with the midterm election. And so we're trying to think about ways to mobilize, to get people registered, to get people informed about what's happening, and to be strategic about how to do that and how to message it. So social media is going to play a major role in that regard. So we're doing a lot of assessing after the fact, and I'm going to be intentional about building coalitions with the folk that we've worked with throughout the planning of the March on Washington, particularly the National Action Network, the NAACP, the National Coalition of Black Civic Participation, the A. Philip Randolph Institute, and many others. So we are conscious about that. We are aware that coalition building and coalition work is the only way that we're going to get this stuff done, and we're committed to that.
Absolutely.
Let me affirm you in another way and in another role. It happens that I also happen to be the vice chair of SCLC of Southern California. And so even as we welcome you to Los Angeles by way of the broadcast, let me say to you that you're welcomed by way of our relationship to you and your relationship to us. That and as you move forward, there are persons across the country and certainly here in Los Angeles who are who partner with you, who are part of the family with you. And we are looking in terms of our new emergence as SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference of Southern California, to put forward addressing these issues. And again, we share the affirmation of economic justice as a critical issue that we're here to make a difference about, because we recognize that all are hurting, and because all are hurting, we have a partnership with one another to address the hurt.
Absolutely. Well, go ahead. You wanted to respond?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the SCLC of Los Angeles and Southern California in particular has always been kind of a force to be reckoned with within the SCLC body. And we recognize, going through some of the older paperwork and looking at some of the magazines, I always come across the great work that SCLC LA has done. And so I'm glad that the chapter out there is still strong, still doing the work, still committed, still working, because that's what we need. You know, it's not about kind of top-down orders given, but it's about those people who are in the communities doing the work. So, I mean, I applaud you guys, and I look forward to coming out there to meet with you all.
Absolutely. You're welcome. Welcome anytime. As we get ready to close our pilot or premiere debut broadcast, if you will, maiden broadcast, Faith on the Front Line right here on LA Talk Live. Want to thank you so much, Reverend Conner, for taking time out of your Friday, and Reverend Timothy McDonald, my co-host.
Thank you.
Absolutely. William Monroe Campbell, my man, Mr. Richard Carr, who's holding it down, and the whole staff of LA Talk Live at the studio in Westchester. We look forward to joining with you again. We'll have a little bit more of our schedule tightened up. We're just trying to get it together at the moment. So I appreciate so much your presence and your prayers. Join us next week. LA Talk Live will host Faith on the Front Line, and we'll be here from 11 to noon. I want to give thanks to Uncle Daryl's restaurant, that's our sponsor, and Doolin's Soul Food Restaurant. So if you're feeling seafood, you can go out in the marina. And if you're feeling soul food, you can go down on Crenshaw and enjoy these two fine establishments where you will be satisfied. Thank you so much again. I'm Dr. Lewis Logan II, and we'll see you next time on Faith on the Front Line.
LA Talk Live, reality radio handcrafted for your listening pleasure. This is LA Talk Live, and we're more than just talk. Stay tuned.